So hello, welcome to Courage Dear Heart. I have got the amazing Eric Zimmer with me this morning, and I'm so excited to be interviewing you. So welcome, Eric.
Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. Eric, I'll just explain who you are a little bit before I ask you some questions. So Eric runs this amazing podcast called The One You Feed, and he's also a behavioral coach. And I found, just by pure luck, your podcast a couple of years ago when I was in a really dark place, and it gave me a sense of light, and it gave me a sense of hope. And so my podcast has been inspired by yours, and I've called it Courage Dear Heart. And funnily enough, I saw a tweet on your timeline on The One You Feed Twitter, and it's a Winston Churchill quote, and it says, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal, it is the courage to continue that counts." And so I was wondering, like, what courage means to you, and how has it shown up in your life?
Well, courage. It's shown up a lot of different ways. I mean, I think it keeps showing up in any life that we are pushing ourselves a little bit. I think courage is kind of a constant need. Now, sometimes it's big courage, sometimes it's little courage. But I mean, I think it's shown up for me from, I can trace it back to being young. I can trace it back to the decision to get sober and the courage that took, the courage it took to work for startup companies, the courage it took to start a solar company, the courage it took to start the podcast, the courage it took to start doing coaching. I mean, the courage it takes to do lots of different things. So, I mean, I think it's a very big part of life. We have a tendency to, if we're not careful, to sort of just settle into a very comfortable life. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, if that's really what we want. But I think a lot of us just go on automatic pilot, and we don't step out of our comfort zone. We don't do things because we want to be comforted. It's kind of wired into us as biological creatures. There is a desire to be comfortable, to conserve energy, to sort of settle in. And so, but for most of us, what we would define a meaningful life as has us having to push out of that. So anytime moving from comfort to discomfort takes some degree of courage. And, it's sort of a cliche at this point to say it, but courage isn't the absence of fear, right? It's really just doing it anyway. It wouldn't be courage if you weren't afraid. And so I think a lot of us think that we should wait until we're not afraid or the fear feels more manageable. And oftentimes that day will never come.
So I love what you said there, and you said something about big courage and little courage. Can you expand a bit more on that for me, please?
Well, I mean, I think if we look at our own lives, we can probably see examples of this. Little courage is things like being willing to have a difficult conversation with somebody that's close to you, although in some cases that can be big courage too. My own life, right? Like little courage would be sending out emails to somebody to ask them to be a guest that, I think is probably unlikely to respond, unlikely to want to be a guest on the show. So that's little courage, right? Big courage is things like launching a podcast as a whole, or trying to think of other examples of bigger courage. I can't think of any at this moment, but I think if you look at your own life, you'll see moments of little courage and big courage, and you'll also look and go, if you look at your life, you also go, oh, there's some areas that I need, those are some small things that I feel like I should do. They make me a little nervous, but, and then there might be a couple things where you're like, whoa, that's a big one. Like it's something I want. It's something that's important, or it's an issue that needs resolved or solved. But you look at it and it feels not just a little overwhelming, but very overwhelming.
Because in my experience, what I see in people is that they show courage and bravery, but they don't necessarily know that. And that's what I wanted to share, stories of courage. You
Right.
you alluded to sobriety, and I don't know if anyone will know your story. Like I know it a little bit. I don't know if you want to talk about it. You said the courage to get sober, and I think that might be important message for some people to hear, certainly in my community.
Sure. Well, I at the age of 24, I was in big trouble. I was a heroin addict. I was homeless. I was really sick. I had hepatitis C, and I was staring down a lot of jail time. I had been arrested for a couple of large felonies, so things were not good. So I got sober at 24, and you know, I think about in context of this conversation, I mean, it took courage to get sober. I sometimes think that like it would have taken a hell of a lot more courage not to at that point, given all the trouble I was in. But that's the diluted nature of addiction, right? Is that we can't even sometimes see that. So yeah, I got sober at that age. Got involved I went to treatment. I went to a long-term recovery living center, which is a much fancier way to describe the crappy place I went, but it sounded nice. So I did that. And then, actually I stayed sober about 8 years, and then I drank again, and I got sober a second time. And that was about 12 years ago. So I've had two sort of instances of getting sober, but I've been in recovery the better part of my entire adult life.
That's amazing. And one thing I've heard you talk about is a moment of clarity before you went into the first home after you last used heroin, or was it before the last time you used heroin? I think that was
kind of in between. I went to a detox center after I had been arrested. I had been living in the back of a van, and now that van was gone. And I basically I was in a point where I was like, I don't know what else to do. And I'm about to be really, really dope sick, and I just don't know what to do. So I'm going to go back to detox. I'm just going to get in detox for a few days to allow me to sort of sort things out a little bit. And while I was there, they said, you need to go to our 28-day treatment program. And my initial reaction to them was, no, I'm not interested. I don't want to do that. And so I said that, and then I kind of went back to my room, and I just had, in recovery, they refer to them as a moment of clarity. And my moment of clarity was very much that I am likely to die if I go back out there. And that if I go back out there, I'm going to use. There was no doubt in my mind that was going to happen. And then also, I just saw very clearly the way this would play out. Like I said, I was really, really sick. I weighed about 100 pounds. I had hepatitis C. I was very sick. And so I was either going to die or I was going to go to jail for a long time. And so I just had a moment of clarity where I was like, this can't go on like this. And so I just said to them, yes, I will do what you recommend that I do next. And that was really the beginning of recovery for me.
Yeah, because the way I sort of liken that is like a voice of wisdom that's kind of, you feel it, you hear it, and that's what I got that sense of when I heard you speaking about it, that moment of clarity. So thank you for sharing that. So one of the reasons I got to you came into my radar as a human being was your podcast, The One You Feed. And you open it always with the parable. And so I'd really like you to share the parable with my listeners, but also to tell me what you heard within that the first time you heard it, and what did you hear within it when you
So the parable is nobody really knows where it comes from. It's traditionally attributed to the Cherokee Indians, but then I've heard lots of people, including some Cherokees, are like, nope, that's not a Cherokee story. So who knows? If I could attribute it, I would. If I don't attribute it to the Cherokees, I get in trouble. If I do attribute it to them, I get in trouble. So I just don't know. So, but it's a great story nonetheless, wherever it comes.
It is, yeah.
There's a grandfather who's talking with his grandson. He says, in life, there are two wolves inside of us that are always at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. and the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And the grandson stops and he thinks about it for a second. And he looks up at his grandfather. He says, well, grandfather, which one wins? And the grandfather says, the one you feed. So that's the parable. And what did I hear in it? I think the thing about parables like that are, on one level, when you hear it, you instantly know what it's about, and it conveys a whole lot of information very quickly. That's what makes a parable like that, or a story, powerful, because it conveys a lot. So, but what I heard in that, when I first heard it, I was early in recovery from heroin, and it was very clear to me that I had a very big bad wolf. My bad wolf, I wasn't feeding the bad wolf so much at that point as the bad wolf was just eating me. But I had fed him a lot, and it just became very clear to me that it's about choice, right? And recovery from an addiction is about choice. It's about, well, I get myself into trouble saying that it's about choice. Let me say this, because you can debate how much addiction is a choice or not a choice, but what is a choice is the action you take to get better from addiction. And so for me, it was very clear. I was given, like, do this, do that, do this, do that. These are the things to do. So it was clear to me how to feed my good wolf in that case. And it was clear to me how to feed my bad wolf. The ultimate form of that would be to use drugs again, but there were lots of little steps on the way to that. So the path seemed very clear to me. And so that parable just really helped put it into perspective for me, that what I was going to get was the thing that I put my attention on. And I think early in recovery in particular, there's a lot of fear about, am I going to use again? Mm-hmm. And I think what I heard in that parable was, if you feed the good wolf, that's the one that will win. You keep doing these things that move you towards your recovery. That's the direction you'll go. And so it was comforting for me in that regard. So yeah, I mean, I think that's what I heard in it in the first time. Now I've read that parable to 250 people probably. It's amazing we've done that many of these. So obviously I've had time to think more about it and have more thoughts on it. But in the beginning, it was a very stark, thing for me, about a way to think about my choices in recovery and what I was going to do each day, and whether that was going to lead me towards sobriety or towards addiction.
So it sounds like you had an insight from within hearing that kind of showed you a different path, or showed you a path that was possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a nice way to sort of clarify what I already was hearing. I mean, I think in recovery, there's lots of people suggesting, here's the path, right? It was a reminder to me to walk that path, and that if I walk that path, then I will feed the good wolf, and the good wolf will win. And if I don't do that, I'll feed the bad wolf, and the bad wolf will win. In my case, it was very clear to me at that time, that the bad wolf would be some form of death or jail, or, all things that none of us want, particularly at 24.
No. Now I've got an 18-year-old son, so I'm trying to steer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've got a 20-year-old, so I'm familiar.
Okay, so obviously you've called your podcast the one you feed. Like, what made you want to start the podcast, call it that? What was the purpose behind it? How did it all start?
Well, there's a short and a long version of that. I'll go with the semi-short one. I had owned a solar energy company, and for a variety of reasons, it was time to it was looking like it wasn't going to work. There were a bunch of government regulations that changed. And so what I decided was that maybe what I would do is create an online course where I taught people to develop large solar energy projects, because that's what I was doing. And so that led me to start looking at online marketing. Like, okay, how would I create a course? How would I sell it? That got me more interested in podcasts. And then eventually I just decided, I don't want to do that. I'm just going to shut this whole thing down. So the solar company ended. I had a consulting job. So I was working, but I was kind of just aimless. I didn't feel like I really had this big thing that was taking my attention or focus. And I also noticed that I was kind of on automatic pilot. What I noticed was that when my brain doesn't have a focus, it wanders towards less than optimal places. It makes me think of that old phrase, your mind's a bad neighborhood, don't go into it alone, right? And so, I wander into that bad neighborhood. And so I don't know how it happened. It kind of all came to me, I don't remember there being a long deliberative process where I was like, oh, I could start a podcast. What would I start it about? I just remember it sort of showing up like I could start a podcast. I could call it The One You Feed. I could read that parable and it would give me a chance to feed my own good wolf. I think that was one of the primary motivations. Was I thought, well, if I have to interview somebody every week, then I'll read their book, which means that I'll be sort of swimming in these ideas, and it will keep my head in the right place. And then my best friend Chris is an audio engineer, and so I also thought it'd be a great chance for him and I to spend more time together to do something. And so those were kind of the primary motivations. So that's kind of how it started.
I love that. And your friend Crete, he's the one who does the voiceover at the beginning, is he?
Yep.
Yeah. And you played, you're musicians together, aren't you?
We're musicians, so all the music in the show, there's intro music, and then there's 2 music breaks in each show. Those are all, we compose all that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it was really just, I didn't do it with the idea like I'll be a professional podcaster or I'll make lots of money, or I just thought it sounded like I would really enjoy doing it. And I have. So
and I've enjoyed you doing it. I've always wondered though, my God, you must read loads of books because they've always got a book, haven't they? Like hundreds and hundreds.
At least one a week. Yep. And
That's
so
amazing.
I probably read, I don't know, 65 books a year, something like that, because I read one for the episode each week. And then, when I can, I'd like to read, I love fiction. So I like to read fiction or science or history or things that they don't really fit on the show. So I'm always kind of trying to squeeze in some of that if I can. Luckily, I like to read. So, I mean, it's not, I won't say that it's never a challenge, because sometimes it's like, well, all right, just finish that interview. All right, go 400 pages,
Yeah, I'm always amazed.
I won't pretend that there aren't times that it's challenging or that I don't feel like doing it, but I love reading. I love learning. So in that way, I'm very well suited to it.
So which one which interview, which book have you got the most out of?
Well, that's like asking a parent to choose which of their 250 children they like the most. I mean, I honestly have no idea how to answer that question. What I could say is, if I had to just pick something right now that's front of mind, I'll pick 2. So I interviewed a spiritual teacher, Adyashanti. It's been a while now. I'm not quite sure why I chose. I mean, he just kind of came on my radar and I chose to interview him, and it was a little different than anything I did, and it completely blew me away. And so I've since been on a couple of retreats with him. We've interviewed him a couple more times. He's become, to me, I would consider him sort of my spiritual teacher at this point. So that was a big one for me. And then another would be, I interviewed a guy named Stephen C. Hayes, who's one of the founders of acceptance and commitment therapy. And he was recommended to me by a listener. He was like, you ought to look into acceptance and commitment therapy because it basically sounds like your show. It sounds like all the different ideas that you're trying to pull together and piece together sound like acceptance and commitment therapy. And when I read his work, I went, holy crap, that's like my worldview articulated. So
cool.
He's got a great book, Get Out of Your Head and Into Your Life, which I love. And so I resonate so very much with all those ideas from acceptance and commitment therapy. And I think it's brilliant the way they've pulled them together. So those are 2 that really stand out as being particularly prominent to me. But usually I'm very much sort of my head is around the ideas of the guests that I've had most recently. So, we just did an interview, released it last night, with a woman named Catherine Gray from England. She's written 2 books. One is The Unexpected Joy of Being Sober. The other is The Unexpected Joy of Being Single. And I think she's wonderful. I could talk to her for 3 days straight, probably. So those interviews are really fun. So, it just, I love the vast majority of them.
Yeah. I mean, you've obviously been on a spiritual journey, and that was what drew me, I think, to your podcast in the first place. So, can you tell me a little bit about that, how you got into that?
Well, so I think I had always had some interest in it. Even before I sort of embarked into active alcoholism and addiction, I had interest in some sort of spirituality. I had been introduced to Buddhism as a teenager, and it really, really resonated with me. There was something about it that just landed on me, and I was just intensely curious about. And so, I took a meditation class when I was 18, which is completely normal now. I mean, kids in college are taking meditation classes, but when I was 18, to take a meditation class was considered bizarre. And I'm amazed there was actually any of them in Columbus, Ohio in those days. So, so I'd had an interest, but it was really sobriety, because I got sober in a 12-step program. And a 12-step program, basically, one of the tenets is that a higher power is what helps keep you sober, or helps get you sober. So I felt like that, I sort of felt thrust into, like, I have to have a spiritual life, because that's what I was being told. And I was desperate. And so I'm really glad that that was the case. I mean, I've wrestled with what a spiritual life is and what that means to me over the years, and it has changed a lot. But I think it first got sort of introduced to me in 12-step recovery, and I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you for sharing that. There was a question I had about your coaching work that you do. You talk about, or allude to, some principles that have nothing to do with strategies and tools. And I wondered, like, if any of my listeners might be interested in your coaching program. So I wondered if you could talk to me a little bit, without obviously giving anything away too much. Like, what are these principles that you talk about?
Well, I think, it depends what people want to work on, but there are some very clear principles for how we change behavior. So there's been a lot of research done at this point about how do you build a habit, how do you break a habit, how do you consistently engage in positive action. And so, I work with people on those principles. A lot of it is really very common sense stuff, but that we don't do. Things like start really small. Be very specific. So I've got a video out there that people can get access to that teaches, like, the number one technique that I teach my coaching clients. And it's basically just, if you're going to make a change and you want to do something, you need to be very clear. I call it a specific why, a specific what, a specific when, and a specific where. So what is it that you want to change? What is the activity you're going to do? Why is it important to you? When are you going to do it? And where are you going to do it? So an example of that might be, most of us have I've had this vague intention a lot of times. I'm going to get in better shape. That's my intention. And then I'm surprised why a month goes by and I'm not in better shape, right? So there's no specificity to that. It's just this vague intention. If, on the other hand, what it is I move it towards, I'm going to exercise 5 days a week at 7 a.m. And I'm going to do that because I know that exercising really makes my mental and emotional health better. That's a lot closer to something that you can actually execute on. And then I would work with people to get even more specific. Okay, what is it at 7 a.m. you're going to do specifically? Where are you going to do it? Okay, if you say you're going to run, where are you going to run? All that sounds trivial, right? On one hand, you're like, well, that's being ridiculous. Like, but I often say that ambiguity can be the mother of procrastination. Because if we don't know specifically what, when, and where something is, it's very easy to put it off. So another principle is to sort of separate decision from action. So for most of us, what happens is we're trying to do both those things at once. We get up and we go, all right, well, I just kind of roll into my day and I'm trying to decide what I'm going to do as I go, and then I actually have to do it. And very often that is overwhelming, and so we just sort of avoid whatever our flavor of avoidance is. So but if we step back and from a place of more clarity, we decide this is what's important to me. These are the steps that will take me there. Here's when I'm going to do them. Then when the time comes, all we have to do is do it. We can put all of our energy into just doing what needs to be done. And so that is one very simple thing that people can do to become much more likely to follow through on their goals, is to have a specific what, why, when, and where.
So the people that you work with, is it change across the board, or is it always kind of sort of addictions?
No, it's rarely addiction. I will work with some people on addiction, but not a whole lot of people. It just depends where they are with their addiction and what's happening. I mean, addiction is a very serious issue. And so I try and be careful about who I work with, whether I think I can really help them, what their willingness is to perhaps seek additional help beyond me. I don't think that one person is capable of getting another person sober. I think it's an important relationship, but I think there needs to be more. So yes, I will work with people on addiction, but it's not the primary. My marketing person will tell you the fact that I can't answer this question more clearly is a problem, because they're always like, you can't help blah, blah. You need to be very specific, right? Which I have resisted.
I'm also have the same resistance, like completely.
Yep. So I mean, what I basically do is I think, my coaching with people is really one of two sort of general areas. One is they know exactly the change they want to make in their life, and they're just unable to do it. And so that, I work with people like that. Doesn't really matter what you're trying to change. If you know what it is, I can help you make that change. So everything from exercise habits to meditation habits to finishing a novel to launching a business, or, whatever you procrastinate on, essentially, we can work on. And then the other category of people are people who just aren't really sure where they're going or what they're doing. And so that's a place to start also, where I help people sort of clarify what's important to them, what direction they want to go. And then we start, marching in that direction. So it's sort of, there's a little bit more work in the beginning where we're seeking clarity. And then we do the same thing. We work to execute the change that people want to make. And then I'm also working on, this isn't available yet, but I'm starting to work on a program around how do you build a meaningful spiritual practice that actually, goes into all aspects of your life. We all, well, not all of us, but a lot of people, particularly if you're listening to a podcast like this, you may have read a lot of different books, but you haven't really noticed the change you would like to have happen. And so this program will be to sort of, how do you take these spiritual principles, but really build them into your life, from formal practices to how do you, carry it with you more through each day. How do you build good spiritual habits, I guess would be a way to say it. So that's in the works also.
So how did you build good spiritual habits?
Well, that's a great question. It took a lot of trial and effort. I think in the same way that I would encourage people to build other habits, I think that I started small. So let's take meditation as an example. This sort of summarizes a variety of different ideas. So I mentioned that I tried to, I took a meditation class when I was 18 years old. And if you can see me on this video, you can tell that was quite some time ago. And so I had been an on again, off again meditator for a long time. And so I would decide meditation is important, and I would decide I was going to do it. And so I'd get a book and it'd be like, meditation, you got to meditate. It's so important. And you should do it for 30 minutes a day.
Mm.
So I would start off and say, all right, meditation is important. I need to do it for 30 minutes. And I would do it for 30 minutes for a little while, and then I would stop because it was really hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
People sit down and they meditate, and it's like they just settle in. It's kind of relaxing. For me, I often joke, it's like the circus comes to town, when I sit down to meditate. And so that would happen, and it would be decidedly unpleasant. And so I would manage to do it for a little while, but then eventually I'd stop. And then a period of time would go by. I'd feel bad about it. I'd pick up another book. It would tell me all the great reasons that meditation is important. It'd say you should do it for 30 minutes. I'd start up. I'd do it 30 minutes, and I'd fail, right? Over and over and over, lots of years. And so finally, about, it's probably been 6 years now, I decided I was going to try something really different. And I said, you know what? I'm going to meditate for 3 minutes a day, but I'm going to do it every day. Like I can do anything for 3 minutes. And so that changed the whole relationship because I was able to do it for 3 minutes. And it's a lot easier to go from 3 minutes to 4 minutes to 5 minutes to 10 minutes than it is to go from not doing something to doing it every day. That's the big leap. The big leap is not doing something to doing it every day consistently. Then just sort of ramping up that thing that you do is much easier. So that's sort of an example of building a spiritual practice that I had to start really small. Now, some people can start, not everybody has to start that small, but for me, for whatever reason, I did. So that's one, that's an example of building a spiritual practice in a way that is congruent with what we know about behavior change.
And that's what worked for you.
Yeah. And then I think the other piece is if you want to have something change you, it has to occupy enough space in your head often enough. It's not good enough to just think about being present once a day and be present for 3 seconds. Like if being more present to your life is something that you want to do, you need to be present more often. And that takes, in a lot of cases, what it takes is reminding. Because our lives are so busy. We get up and boom, before we know it, we're in bed. And so if we want to do more of these things, we need to figure out, how do we remind ourselves? How do we get prompts that say, okay, it's time to try and be present? Or how do we remember who we want to be in relationship? Or so it's also then about how do we structure and put systems in place that allow us to be more conscious of the person we want to be, to go off of autopilot more often.
So I could ask you loads more questions, but I'm aware of time. So what I wanted to ask you one last thing is, there are many people probably listening who struggle with alcohol or food or some form of sort of habit, or just a preoccupation with something, thoughts even. What can you offer as a way of sort of hope or wisdom to those people?
Well, I'm a big believer that change can occur, and significant change, right? Like, I don't think we evolve out of being human, right? I don't think that like a lot of us approach spirituality because we're like, well, I just never want to feel bad again in my life, right? That's not a reasonable aspiration. That said, significant change is possible. I mean, I'm an example, but there's thousands of them, if not there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of examples out there of people who were once in a place, whether it be addiction, whether it be people who were really overweight who aren't now, people who were depressed who aren't now. I mean, so significant change is possible. I guess that would be the hope I would offer, is it really can happen. it often takes a variety of experimentation, and it takes continuing to try. One of the things they say in the 12-step program when you come, and they just say it over and over and over again, which is keep coming back. And the reason that that is said is because if you keep coming back, if you just keep showing up and trying, things will get better. It's when we give up and don't try that we're sort of doomed or destined to whatever our situation is. So a lot of us, we start down a path and maybe we have a little bit of success and then it sort of falls apart on us. Or we start down a path and we don't see any real quick success and we give up. And just not giving up is kind of the name of the game with any of this stuff, is to keep trying. So depression, like I have a couple of friends who suffer with like serious grade depression, not like, I mean, like hospitalization type depression. And one of them in particular, he has just kept trying. He tries something and it maybe works for a little bit and then it stops working. But he just picks himself back up and tries something else. And then he tries something else. He just keeps going. And so his life is, his life is way, way, way better than it would have been. And then I know other people who don't. They start something, they get mildly discouraged, and then they just stop again for a long period of time. And then eventually they feel miserable enough and they take a step or two, and that step or two doesn't seem to make a lot of difference. And boom, again, they stop or they give up. Whereas if you can just keep walking, however haltingly, however slowly, if you keep walking, things get better. And it is often 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but that's still a step forward. We often hear that phrase and we go, oh, 2 steps forward, and we get discouraged by it. But if we just accept like that's reality, then we don't get so discouraged when we're taking the 1 step backwards, because we know we're about to take 2 more forward shortly. So,
and what does backwards even mean anyway? Like,
right. Yeah. I mean, I think that we define what backwards means often. Backwards in this case could be, I was exercising every day and I didn't for the last 3 days. Backwards could be, I was feeling so much better, but, I feel really sad again the last couple of days. Or backwards could be, I was doing so well eating and then I just now had 3 brownie sundaes. Right? Backwards takes lots of different forms. If we want to talk about alcohol or drug addiction, a backward step could be, I drank again. What most of us do, though, is we can turn that into a catastrophe.
Yeah.
And we can think that backward step means we're doomed to fail. And we will be doomed to fail if we take that backward step as that. If we take it as like, oh, see, I knew I couldn't do it. But if we accept that that's just going to happen, then we just take the next forward step. So, I guess if there was one thing I could offer people, it would be that, keep trying.
Thank you, Eric, so much. And where can people find you if they want to find out more about you or the podcast or the work that you do?
Yeah. For the coaching program and that video I talked about, it's ericzimmer.coach. And then the podcast itself is at oneyoufeed.net, and you can find the podcast. You can also get to the coaching page from there, and I've got a reading list and all kinds of other little things. So that's how.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure and a real honor to talk to you. And I thank you personally from me for being that little voice of wisdom in my ear for so long.
Well, thank you for having me, and it was a pleasure being on. I'm so glad you're doing this.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay.